Sleep and study. Don't forget to subscribe.
Hello? Today we will talk about myths about evolution. We will not only get acquainted with different myths, but also try to understand how evolutionary theory has changed over the last 200 years of its existence. Not 200, let it be about 150, although from what to count, really, that's also a big question. Let's start by trying to at least roughly understand why there are so many myths surrounding evolutionary theory in particular. After all, biology is quite a large field of science, with many different theories. Some were invented a very long time ago, others are quite recent, but perhaps there are no other theories like the theory of evolution that have sparked so many different debates, so many different statements, so many different, I don't know, memes, if you like. Even in the times when Charles Darwin had just literally published his book, many different caricatures appeared, including those featuring Darwin himself. Why is this so? What is it connected with? Let's try to figure it out. To begin with, it's important to establish what evolution is. According to one of the definitions, modern, not Darwinian, evolution is the irreversible and to some extent directed historical development of living nature, accompanied by changes in the genetic composition of populations, the formation of adaptations, the creation and extinction of species, and the transformation of biocenoses and the biosphere as a whole. I am sure that many people, hearing this definition, already started to suspect why there are so many myths surrounding evolution. Probably at least because evolution is something absolutely incomprehensible. But at the very least, this definition contains a lot of words, a lot of terms, and for some, they might seem too complicated and confusing. Although if you don't get into the details and don't try to create such an extremely careful and precise definition, evolution can be explained quite simply. Evolution is the change in the surrounding nature according to changes in the inorganic world, as well as changes in some individual parts of this very nature. Understandably, every organism has to adapt. Biologists really like this word. It is necessary to adapt both to changes in the environment and to other organisms. Well, actually, in trying to survive, in trying to adapt, organisms gradually change. That is, they evolve. It seems to be more or less simple. It's simple, but when it comes to, I don't know, the slight growth of a beak in some finch, most people don't have any particular questions. Yes, let the beak grow and evolve. But when one animal radically changes, transforms into another, and when, God forbid, some ancient primate turns into a human, that's something extraordinary. Then many people start to question whether this is really the case and what the evidence for it is. Well, we might talk a bit more about the evidence of human origins from ancient primates today, but for now, let's move on. I propose to now look at why there was a need for such an evolutionary theory and what it was actually able to explain. After all, any theory is good if it can bring some additional knowledge about the surrounding world. If it's just a theory for the sake of theory, it's not very clear why it was developed in the first place. But in fact, evolutionary theory turned out to be so comprehensive, so beautiful and elegant, that it was able to explain a lot, even much more than we could have originally imagined. Firstly, evolutionary theory was able to explain why the world around us is so diverse. How did this diversity come about? Why are individual parts of animals so perfect? Animals are so brilliantly adapted to the environment, and why individual species are so well adapted, occupy such a clear niche, and in this niche they are real kings. In addition, it was evolutionary theory that allowed us to explain how complex forms could appear without the need for any creator or author of these individual complexities. But since we've more or less figured out why evolutionary theory is needed and what it is, now I propose to come directly to the various myths. The first myth that I would like to discuss today is the myth that the cell is too complex to arise from non-living nature. This implies that the only way the first cell could have originated is if someone had designed it. Actually, I will not try to prove that there is no great entity that designs everything in this world and perhaps even created the laws of nature. In principle, if we assume that this entity created the laws itself, then its existence or non-existence is practically impossible to prove. And honestly, the task of science is not to, rather, the task of faith is not to prove anything. Faith is faith, while science is what tries to prove and justify something. So today, we will try to understand, within the framework of science, how it is possible to assume the emergence of this or that, or certain changes, without any higher entities. Whether there is such an entity or not remains, as they say, a matter of personal belief. It's up to you to believe or not. So, acting within the framework of science, let's assume that indeed only the laws of nature could have somehow created the first cell. Is this possible or not? According to the first myth, no, it is categorically impossible. Now we will try to understand why such a myth arose and how it can be refuted. So, indeed, if we look at modern nature, it is very complex. There are many different forms, and it is difficult to imagine that they appeared by themselves. But if we operate within the framework of evolutionary theory, we understand that over millions of years, some small transformations can lead to colossal outcomes. Indeed, gradually different organisms can diverge so far from each other that completely different beings will appear. Some, like plants, will obtain energy simply from the sun, while other organisms will get energy by eating others. Some organisms will be actively mobile, while others will just grow and increase in size, remaining quite stationary for most of their lives. Let's suppose. But still, if we keep simplifying life further and further, we eventually come down to the cell. In principle, within the framework of evolutionary theory, we can roughly imagine how the cell gradually evolved and became more complex, then formed multicellular forms, and then all the diversity of living beings appeared. But it is simply impossible to simplify life beyond the cell because at the moment the cell is the simplest living being. You might say that there are even simpler living organisms than cells, viruses. And to some extent, you would be right, but not entirely, because viruses cannot exhibit the characteristics of living organisms outside of a cell. So, while they may be simpler than cells, they still don't function without a cell. Therefore, the cell is the simplest form of life. The simplest among cells is the bacterial cell, or if you know the term archaea. Actually, now all these so-called prokaryotic nucleus-free organisms are divided into true bacteria and archaea are even simpler than bacteria. But even if we look at a bacterium or an archaeon, we understand that it is also quite a complex substance. Inside there is a cell envelope, a membrane, and the cytoplasm, a fluid with a specific chemical composition filled with a large number of proteins floating in it, many of which are quite complexly organized. To function properly, these bacterial or archaeal cells contain a very complex genetic apparatus. Although it's simpler than in eukaryotic nuclear cells, with significantly fewer components, it's still a very complex genetic chain. Looking at this creature, it's hard to imagine that it emerged from nowhere. There's even a famous statement made in a book from the 80s saying that the likelihood of life appearing in this way, simply from non-living nature, by random combination of different elements, is comparable to the chance of a tornado assembling a Boeing 747 from scrap parts in a junkyard. Obviously, the probability of such an event is extremely low. Therefore, to imagine that somewhere in the primordial soup, under the influence of lightning, the first cell suddenly assembled from different blocks is something utterly fantastic and practically impossible to conceive. What conclusion should follow from this? At first glance, one might conclude that the cell probably did not assemble itself, but rather that it was assembled by someone. But if we try to operate within the framework of modern science, we can come to a different conclusion, referring to the same evolutionary theory that simply the cell is not the simplest form of life. And the new data that we are now obtaining with the help of biology show that indeed, most likely the most ancient organisms, which are now gone, but they were even before the first cell, they were much simpler, and they were just separate molecules that reproduced, evolved, fed, but at the same time were arranged as simply as possible. So they were just kind of chemical substances, but they were already alive. Indeed, if we even refer to the same concept of these Boeing 747s that could assemble themselves, we understand that even they don't just assemble randomly. Each airplane has undergone a long evolutionary path, although it's not biological evolution, but the evolution of engineering thought. This engineering thought has followed a path similar to that of living nature. Gradually, airplanes were perfected, engines were improved. There was even a kind of natural selection. In other words, some airplanes crashed, others failed certain tests and therefore never took to the sky. Over time, they continually improved. Individual parts in airplanes changed, new innovations appeared, some unusual designs emerged. I could say these were new adaptations, if we speak in biological terms. Over more than 100 years of airplane evolution, we have reached the Boeing 747. So it's not so simple here either. Very often they say, for example, that there is this, I think they call it the watchmaker effect or watchmaker analogy, that if you see a watch, it means that there was a watchmaker who assembled it. Well, on the one hand, the idea seems to be logical, but on the other hand, even when a watch was assembled, it was also assembled by a watchmaker for a reason. Watches have also traveled a long evolutionary path, and this mechanism was formed during hundreds of years of evolution of engineering thought, from the simplest watch to the watches we see now. And of course, the same was true with the cell. Initially, only individual molecules appeared. According to current data, this happened more than 4 billion years ago. Then, only about 4 billion years ago, the first cellular organisms appeared. 3,800,000,000 years ago, cells of a more or less modern type emerged, not like ours, but like those of contemporary archaea and bacteria. That is, apparently, when they first originated. The next stage occurred around 2.5 billion years ago, when the first eukaryotic cell, a cell with a nucleus, appeared. This cell was more complex, larger, and capable of forming multicellular organisms. And around 2,100,000,000 years ago, there was this first experiment with multicellularity, which was likely unsuccessful. Subsequently, there were several attempts to create multicellularity in nature, meaning things were not so straightforward, and not everything was constructed immediately. Evolution is nonlinear after all. It was only about 800 to 900 million years ago that relatively simple organisms like sponges appeared. About 600 million years ago, more complex multicellular organisms with more differentiated tissues and first organs appeared. And over the last 600 to 650 million years, all the great diversity of multicellular beings that we observe now has emerged. To some extent, evolution gradually accelerates and intensifies. But let's return to the very beginning. All right, we've established that the very first living organisms must have been some kind of molecules. Where were they located? How did they live? What did they look like? These are numerous and quite complex questions that modern science tries to answer. According to one of the more progressive theories currently proposed, the very first organisms, these molecular living beings, did not inhabit the primordial soup, as our classic school textbooks once told us, but in what is called a primordial pizza, that is, between layers of clay. Between the layers of clay, individual molecules accumulated, creating an effect similar to a cell. That is, a membrane appeared, albeit a mineral one, in which many different organic substances and molecules accumulated. Intense chemical reactions took place, and there, life began to develop gradually. What's particularly interesting is that the clay protected from harsh ultraviolet radiation, allowing such life to exist and slowly evolve. But what did this life consist of? We have three excellent molecules that could theoretically have been the very first living beings. One of them is DNA, a really cool molecule, the supreme carrier of all sorts of information, like an encyclopedia that has everything about life written in it. It's a great thing, but it has one drawback. Right now, it can't do anything by itself. It only carries information and is capable of passing this information on. On the other hand, there are such fun guys as proteins, also very good organic molecules, capable of doing almost everything. Proteins are energy stations, main builders, and accelerators, i.e., catalysts of chemical reactions. In short, proteins are like the workhorses that do everything in living organisms. However, they cannot create themselves and store information. Proteins don't make proteins. There's another interesting molecule, RNA, which sits between DNA and proteins. It's like an ordinary courier that collects information, these letters from DNA, and delivers them to the proteins, which are then synthesized. Actually, they are synthesized using the RNA template, but still, it's just a transmission link, seemingly nothing special. However, if we take a closer look at RNA, it turns out to have great potential. The thing is, unlike DNA and proteins, RNA can theoretically both carry and encode information. We didn't know this before, but now there are RNA viruses. Of course, they didn't just appear now. They most likely emerged around 4 billion years ago, but we only learned about them relatively recently. There are indeed viruses built purely on RNA, where RNA is the main carrier of information, thus performing the function of DNA. On the other hand, it turns out that RNA can unexpectedly also perform the function of proteins. It is particularly important in accelerating reactions. This is what distinguishes many biological processes from chemical ones. They occur much faster and at normal temperatures. So, RNA, like protein catalysts, can also act as a catalyst. There are special RNA ribozymes that can accelerate reactions. After discovering that RNA possesses unique properties of both DNA and proteins, the concept of the so-called RNA world emerged. According to this concept, the very first molecule was RNA. RNA stood at the beginning of all life. Then, RNA slowly began to evolve, proteins were added to it, then DNA was added, and then all this was enveloped in some kind of membrane, resulting in the very first cell. How all this happened is, of course, not entirely clear to us now. Unfortunately, we can only attempt to reconstruct this history from bits and pieces that have been preserved in our genetic code, or from certain molecules that have survived in ancient rock formations. Unfortunately, this is such a complex task that not even a detective would envy the scientists, because there are very few clues left, and the crime of life's appearance on planet Earth happened so long ago. But gradually, the picture is becoming clearer and clearer, and we now understand that, in principle, starting from the assembly of the first RNA and the beginning of Darwinian evolution, which is well known to us, all the diversity of living organisms that we know today could have emerged. The only remaining question to completely dispel this myth and prove that indeed, according to the ordinary laws of nature, the very first living organism could assemble from non-living nature, is to demonstrate how this first RNA could have assembled itself. Assembling RNA that could replicate itself and extract energy from its surroundings is also a very complex task. Basically, the probability that even in ideal conditions the exact kind of RNA that could become alive would assemble is infinitesimally small. These are fractions of a percent so minuscule that we wouldn't even consider such a probability under normal circumstances. However, if we turn to statistics and roughly estimate the number of stars in the universe, the figures are astronomical, with numbers having 10 zeros. The slide here shows more precise figures. There are between 2 to 4 times 10 to the 11th power stars in each galaxy. Approximately that many galaxies exist in the visible part of the universe, and there could be many more. Around each of these stars orbits a certain number of planets. If not around every star, then around many of them. And around some stars, there are far more planets than around our Sun. Among them, about 20% of the planets are somewhat similar to Earth, meaning theoretically conducive to the emergence of life. If we calculate all this, it turns out that there are about 2 times 10 to the 21st power of planets that are theoretically suitable for life. This number is absolutely fabulous. And if on each of these planets, millions of molecules randomly assembled, the probability that life could have originated on at least one of these planets is very high. If this really did happen on one particular planet, we know exactly which one. And it's possible that this planet was not alone in this regard. If we also consider other physical theories, such as the theory of inflationary cosmology, it suggests that our universe is just a part of the cosmos. There are other universes where the physical laws differ slightly from ours. In such a case, across this vast, though not infinite number of universes, the number of planets and the attempts at life emerging are so numerous that the attempts to create life reach the power of 10 to the 1,000th to the millionth. These are figures beyond our comprehension. If this is indeed the case, then the emergence of life in the cosmos becomes practically inevitable. Thus, the first myth is debunked by 2 positions. Firstly, the very first cell could have arisen through Darwinian evolution from simpler, precellular, essentially molecular forms of life. And the emergence of the very first molecule, which we now consider to be an RNA molecule, was possible due to the enormous number of attempts at its formation in our vast universe and perhaps in an almost boundless cosmos. The sheer number of attempts makes even the smallest scenario absolutely plausible, and thus the emergence of life becomes simply inevitable. Well, we've dealt with the first myth, albeit a complex one. Moving on, the next topic is even more lively and well known. Anyone who doesn't quite trust the theory of evolution knows the myth that evolution is a theory existing only in the minds of some scientists and is essentially unobservable. Thus, if there's no observable evolution now, who can prove that it ever existed or that it's currently inactive? This reminds me of an incident in our Darwin Museum where the so-called evolution path attraction was closed, and the controller there was saying, "Sorry, evolution is not working right now. Please come back another time." Many people think that evolution indeed is not currently active. Is this true or not? Let's find out. Here's some evidence that evolution is literally happening right now before our eyes. Well, the first piece of evidence, which I'm sure just about everyone will accept without reservation, is that different microorganisms are constantly changing, starting with bacteria, which adapt to any antibiotics after a while, and ending with our familiar COVID virus, which is constantly in the news, and we hear about a new strain emerging every few months. Hooray! A new strain of coronavirus has appeared. Long live the coronavirus. If new strains are appearing, it means that the coronavirus, in principle, is evolving, despite many attempts to prove that evolution does not exist. But the fact that the virus has a couple of modifications is cool, of course, but it seems that the virus has not turned into a human. So many people are not very impressed by such small changes. Well, let's move on to something bigger, like butterflies. There's a charming butterfly called the birch-peppered moth. This is generally such a classic school example. Many people have heard of it. But if you have not heard of it or have forgotten, I will remind you of it. The story with these butterflies was as follows. Throughout most of human history, these moths were predominantly white with black spots, camouflaging themselves against birch trees. Occasionally, there were moths known as melanists, which were completely black. Naturally, a black moth on a white birch tree was very noticeable, so they were more often eaten and left very few offspring. According to classic evolutionary theory, they hardly survived. There were very few of them. They appeared only occasionally as a random mutation and then quickly disappeared. With the industrial era, birch trees around factories began to darken, and unexpectedly, after some time, biologists noticed that a large portion of peppered moths also turned black. This meant that while previously the white moths with black spots were the ones that survived, now it was the black moths that were surviving, and the white ones with black spots started to get eaten more. Here you have evolution in action. Again, this might seem like just a variation in coloration rather than a new species, so yes, it's evolution, but it might not be enough to impress many. They might say it's a minor change. Then let's move to larger changes. There's a remarkable bird called the finch. Some even call them Darwin's finches because they were studied by Charles Darwin. Darwin noticed that finches on different islands were slightly different. These birds have various beak shapes and sizes. They're almost identical, but have minor variations, suggesting they didn't all appear at once. Probably they had a common ancestor and then began to change slightly, adapting to the available food on each island. These observations gradually led Darwin to the idea of evolutionary theory. But now, finches have made a new contribution to evolution. They evolved right before our eyes, and we have a new species of finches. How did this happen? I'll tell you in about 30 seconds. Meanwhile, you can also look at the last picture, featuring the fabulous Italian wall lizard, which, in my opinion, is the coolest example of modern evolution. What is this example? You'll find out in about a minute. Now, back to the finches. So what happened to these very mysterious finches? What happened is as follows. For many years, on the island of Daphne, there lived these small, charming Darwin's finches with small beaks, these little black birds. You can see them in the first picture. On another island, Hispaniola, lived larger finches. You can also observe them now and see their differences. They were, of course, very different from the finches of Daphne Island, and they never interbred. Then a rather mundane event occurred. One of the finches from Hispaniola flew to Daphne Island and mated with a smaller finch. Unexpectedly, this led to a new hybrid species that produced fertile offspring, secured its traits, and is now recognized as a distinct species, with absolutely clear characteristics and a unique genetic code. We literally witnessed the emergence of a new species of finches. However, this species arose through crossbreeding, not gradual changes, so it might not entirely convince those skeptical of evolution. Let's then move to the last example, which is perhaps the most vivid and impressive. This is the Italian wall lizard example. In 1971, scientists decided to try, so to speak, to achieve some kind of evolution with these lizards. These lizards lived on a single island, Podkopiste, a small island. They had a distinct appearance and a specific diet. They were well studied for a long time. It was known that they were primarily carnivorous, although plant-based food also made up about 25 to 30% of their diet. They were transported to a neighboring island, Podmorcharu. 30 years later, these lizards were captured again to see how much they had changed simply by being in new conditions. On the new island, there was much less suitable animal food for these lizards, but much more suitable plant food. What did these lizards do? Instead of, say, perishing as many self-respecting lizards might, or feeling very unwell, they thrived and reproduced, but in the process, they changed, adapting primarily to a plant-based diet. Now, plant food makes up about 80 to 90% of their diet. Not only did their dietary preferences change, but their physical appearance also changed. They became larger, and the size of their gastrointestinal tract significantly increased. They underwent some genetic changes, but perhaps the most paradoxical and surprising change was in the structure of their stomach, where an additional valve appeared, which hadn't existed before at all. This valve delays the food in the stomach. It's known that plant food takes longer to digest than animal food, and therefore needs to stay longer in the gastrointestinal tract. It's no coincidence that herbivorous animals, like cows and horses, have a good fermentation chamber, a large stomach with multiple compartments, and a luxurious, long intestine. Similarly, these lizards gradually lengthened their gastrointestinal tract, and they did this on their own, without any hints or special intervention from genetic engineers or artificial selection. Natural selection took place. The only thing humans did was to move the lizard to a new environment, creating a new population in new conditions. So, we witness evolution live, right before our eyes. Of course, the lizard didn't turn into, say, a bird, but unfortunately, such a radical transformation doesn't happen in 30 years. It would require at least a paltry 10 or 20 million years. And, unfortunately, humans can't observe such changes over such a long period. The fact that the lizard changed, even morphologically, I think, is a very vivid proof that evolution exists. Let's move on to the third myth. Those who dispute the existence of evolution often claim that transitional forms simply do not exist. Where are these transitional links? Assert the staunch opponents of evolutionary theory. Show us even one. Well, since you ask, I'll show you a few. Thank God, paleontology is now experiencing a new renaissance. In principle, a huge amount of paleontological research is being conducted. A vast number of paleontological discoveries are being made. There is a re-examination of old materials. Many new taxa are being discovered. And now, such a number of these transitional links, which supposedly do not exist, have accumulated that science has even abandoned the term transitional link or missing link. Essentially, we now simply see many of these links that are gradually evolving, changing. But let's look at something typically transitional to prove that it really exists. For instance, a transitional form from some kind of lizard-like creature to a form that is quite typical of a turtle, essentially a sort of proto-turtle. It is called Odontochelys. It lived about 220 million years ago and was found in the Guizhou province in China. What is good about Odontochelys? Well, it is similar in body shape to a turtle, but it lacks the main turtle traits, or they are only just beginning to appear. As is known now, turtles have absolutely no teeth. Odontochelys, in contrast, had quite a few teeth. However, it already had a small rudimentary beak. It also had an incredibly interesting shell. It was not yet fully formed, and we can literally observe the formation of the shell on it. It had half a shell. The underside of the shell had already become hard, while the top was still quite soft. So, it turned out to be a kind of semi-shelled turtle. Well, I don't know what more transitional a form than Odontochelys one might need, but actually, as I've already said, I'm just highlighting Odontochelys, while there is now a huge number of such transitional forms among turtles. For example, there is Papochelys, which is like a turtle that swallowed saucers, or rather a lizard that swallowed saucers. By all appearances a lizard, but with large ribs. There is also an animal like Jeholornis, which had a fabulous beak, but no shell at all yet. So, there are a great number of these transitional forms, and essentially a very beautiful sequence, sort of from something resembling a lizard to a turtle, is very well established. The next representative of such a good transitional form is Jeholornis. Apologies again, it's from China. But what can we do? Chinese paleontology is currently leading the world, and a vast number of discoveries, new and very cool, well studied in detail, indeed originate from China. Many of you have heard about the transitional links between ancient reptiles and birds, primarily about Archaeopteryx. Why am I showing you someone else and not it? First, for variety. I think everyone is a bit tired of Archaeopteryx, to be honest. Secondly, according to modern scientific views, Archaeopteryx did not evolve into a bird. It was a dead-end branch, an unsuccessful attempt at making a bird. Nature experimented, but something went wrong, and Archaeopteryx had no descendants. Jeholornis, or at least something very close to it, really became a bird. Although it's not Archaeopteryx, but rather a different creature, be it a lizard or a bird, call it what you will, it has traits of both a classic dinosaur and a fully fledged bird. Firstly, many feather imprints were found. It was all set with feathers. Honestly, as we now know, many fossilized dinosaurs had feathers too. Many dinosaurs were feathered, which is quite a typical trait for them. Furthermore, in Jeholornis, we can observe well-formed wings that were likely fully functional. Judging by the structure of Jeholornis, it was already well adapted to flight. However, it still had a long, typical dinosaur-like tail, and of course, those famous Archaeopteryx dinosaur fingers on the wings that could be used for grasping, for example, a branch. Indeed, such little claws on wings were an original design that was popular only during the Mesozoic era. Nowadays, it's no longer fashionable to grow claws on wings, so alas, most birds have abandoned this feature. Of course, there are some birds that flirt a little with this idea and try to develop something like a claw. But these are secondary changes. We won't discuss that now. In short, when we look at Jeholornis, we see that it has a skeleton that is part bird, part dinosaur, and currently there's even a lack of consensus on how to classify it. It's unclear whether it's a dinosaur or a bird. But most scientists simply don't fuss over it and say that any bird is a dinosaur. In that case, Jeholornis is just a bird-like dinosaur. That's all there is to it. Next, we're going to look at the Maiacetus, another great transitional link between the land ancestor of cetaceans and the modern whale. Again, if we delve into paleontology and look at the multitude of known ancestors of cetaceans, we unexpectedly discover that the ancestors of cetaceans trace back to the distant Paleogene period, when ancient whales clattered their hooves along the shores of lakes, occasionally entering these lakes to fish. And I'm not misspeaking about hooves. Indeed, as we now know, the ancestors of cetaceans were even-toed ungulates. That's why scientists now unite all even-toed ungulates and cetaceans into a single group called Cetartiodactyla. The creature you are now presented with, Maiacetus, is not quite a hoofed terrestrial animal, but not yet fully a whale either. It's somewhat whale-like in structure, streamlined and well adapted for swimming, with a splendid tail fin that aids in acceleration while swimming. However, it still had limbs and, as we know, occasionally came ashore. How do we know this? Because the female Maiacetus was found with an unborn calf, a pregnant mother. It was observed that the calf in her womb was positioned head first. If offspring are born underwater head first, they could drown. This suggests that female Maiacetus were compelled to come ashore at least during childbirth. But a few million years later, the descendants of Maiacetus no longer needed to do this, and the fetuses in their wombs rotated. Now, as we know, dolphins and whales all give birth with the offspring emerging tail first. The Maiacetus lived about 47 million years ago in what is now known as Pakistan. And finally, as humans, we are naturally most interested in primates. This is a fact that scientists have been trying to convey to the public for the last 150 years. Various transitional forms are constantly being discovered, despite some people's attempts to prove their non-existence. And there's an ongoing search for that specific transitional form between ancient apes and humans. However, there are now so many transitional forms that a beautiful sequence has been established. For example, creatures such as Australopithecus have been known for a long time. Overall, they were very similar to apes, but were already bipedal. Relatively recently, in the 90s, the remarkable Ardipithecus was discovered and thoroughly studied in 2009. Upon examination, it was found to be a fantastic transitional form between a creature like a chimpanzee or gibbon, which lived around 10 million years ago, and Australopithecus, which lived about 4 million years ago. It combines features of a bipedal Australopithecus and a quadrupedal tree-climbing ape. For instance, its toes still resemble those of our tree-climbing ancestors. And indeed, if you look closely at other features, you can find many other interesting details. So, Alice and Alec, if someone still doubts that we are closely related to primates and that our ancestor was a primate, well, science proves that this version is indeed the most accurate. But come on, primates are not really the worst relatives. Continuing the theme of human evolutionary origins, I would like to address the next myth that irrational and chaotic evolution could not create such a perfect being as a human. That is, humans are so perfect that they must be the product of some higher intelligence's design and it cannot be otherwise. But I will now try to prove to you that even if a higher intelligence does exist, again, it's everyone's personal belief whether to believe in it or not, the emergence of humans absolutely does not require the existence of a higher intelligence. Humans could indeed have arisen through a long process of evolution. Moreover, they bear numerous traces of this lengthy evolutionary path, and frankly, they are not as perfect as often claimed. So let's start with a super perfect human organ like the eye. It might seem that the eye is simply perfect. It's so uniquely structured, so complex, that it's hard to imagine it arising through some sort of transformations. And indeed, how can a partial eye, for example, come into existence? Evolution is supposed to be gradual. How, for instance, could an eye develop without a lens or retina? If an eye is missing even one element, it simply won't function. Thus, the eye must have appeared only in the form we now see it. It's a product of perfect design, many might think. But in reality, if we take a closer look, we'll see that inside the eye there are some how to put it, very unusual details, which prove that the eye is a product of evolution. The most striking example is the structure of the retina. You may have heard of the blind spot in our eye. Some might have even tried to find it, for instance, by closing one eye and gradually moving a finger towards the eye. At some point, the finger disappears. There are also experiments with dots drawn on a paper, where at some point the dot also vanishes. You can search for these tests on the internet on how to find your blind spot. In any case, if you don't believe it, check for yourself. You do have a blind spot in your eye. And you must agree, if the eye is a product of perfect design, why would it have a blind spot? Indeed, there is no need to create a blind spot in the eye. It wasn't deliberately made. It occurred due to a rather amusing evolutionary phenomenon. During the evolutionary process, it so happened that the nerves connecting to our brain approached the retina not from the outside, as one might logically assume, but from the inside. Imagine if, in a camera, wires approached the lens not from behind the objective, but were instead inserted directly through the front glass. That would be odd, right? But indeed, that's exactly how it is in our eye. The wires come from the front, and the sensors to which these wires are connected are located behind the wires, making it harder for them to capture light. Not only do the nerves partially obstruct the retina, but they also have to go somewhere. These nerves converge into a single bundle and exit the retina at a specific point, right where our blind spot is located. So, you see, our eye is, to put it mildly, not exactly perfect. Could it have been done differently? Of course, it could have been. Moreover, in reality, independent evolution led to the development of a more perfect eye. Not in primates or even in mammals, but, I beg your pardon, in octopuses. Octopuses have eyes very similar to human eyes, but they evolved completely independently. While the organ turned out to be very similar, its structure in detail is radically different. In particular, the wires to the sensors in octopuses approach from behind, from the logical side. Octopuses do not have a blind spot. They see a complete image with their entire retina. Why? Because their evolution led to such an eye. Our evolution took a different path, and inadvertently resulted in the kind of eye we have now. Another example of our body not being so perfect is the structure of our oropharynx. Everyone knows that humans can theoretically choke. There are various ways to help a poor, unfortunate person who has choked, how to save them. Indeed, if someone has choked severely, they literally need to be rescued. In the worst cases, surgery is sometimes necessary. You might have even seen some scary videos on the internet where a tube or a pen is inserted into the throat to prevent a person from suffocating, and then medical professionals arrive and start rescuing the person. Why does this happen? For one simple reason. Our digestive tract and respiratory tract meet in the oropharynx, and they are separated only by a small cartilage. So if a piece of food is too large or accidentally goes the wrong way, it can block the airway, potentially leading to a person's death. You must agree, this is not the most perfect way of structuring the respiratory system. Could it have been done differently? Yes. And again, nature proves that it can be done differently. Birds and reptiles followed a slightly different evolutionary path than synapsids, to which we mammals belong. Birds and reptiles have evolved such that their respiratory and digestive tracts are completely separated. Therefore, birds or lizards can swallow large prey, like a big fish, and while this fish completely blocks their throat, they don't suffocate because they breathe independently. In my opinion, this is a more perfect structure. But unfortunately, in humans, it turned out differently. The next imperfect organ, which of course many are also aware of, well, approximately half of the Earth's population definitely knows about it, namely the female half, about the fact that childbirth is a very, very difficult thing, and in fact, in many cases, women simply cannot give birth naturally, or some monstrous problems arise, and it is necessary to resort to the operation cesarean section. Why does all this happen? Because humans have a very narrow birth canal. And what is the reason for this? It is actually related to our bipedalism, because to walk upright, a sufficiently narrow pelvis is needed. But on the other hand, to give birth to a relatively large baby, a wide pelvis is needed. However, in the end, nature came to some kind of compromise. It is neither too narrow nor too wide. Well, it seems you can walk and seemingly give birth, but not everything goes perfectly. By the way, there is another evolutionary reason that could have led to the birth canal being quite narrow. This is the very rapid development of the human brain over the last 2 million years of evolution. It's possible that during this time the birth pathways did not evolve quickly enough, and in the end, when the brain was small, the babies were small and were born very easily, but now women, let's just say, have a tough time. If you think that these are the only imperfections of the human body, and these are the only examples of how we are not so well, let's say, designed, think again. These are just the most striking examples. There are, for example, some nerves in our body that make just some monstrous perfect loops. Literally, these nerves are like twisted wires, and it's unclear why these loops are necessary. Nerves could have been routed straight, but they are arranged this way for one sole reason, because that's how it happened over millions of years of evolution. There are, for instance, some nerves that remain without a sheath, just bare, exposed nerves. One of these cool nerves is located in our elbow. If someone has hit their elbow really hard, so much so that it sends a piercing sensation through the entire body, then you know how it feels to have an exposed nerve. There are also a lot of other not so perfect organs in our body. But besides imperfect organs, There are organs that we simply don't need at all, and they are not even fully developed. Why do we have them? Well, simply because they were inherited from our distant ancestors. They're called vestigial organs. This is the remnant of a third eyelid. It's called Darwin's tubercle, which remains on the ear, and in fact, it's not on everyone's ears, but some people have it well developed, while others less so. You can check how well developed it is on you. Right here on the outer part of the earlobe, you can try to feel for this Darwin's tubercle. It is a remnant of the pointed ear of very ancient primates, similar to half monkeys, like lemurs. From our distant ancestors, who lived about 50 million years ago and resembled lemurs, we have retained this little piece of an elfin ear. There are other interesting organs as well. For instance, the role of the appendix is still not very clear, but it is known that in our distant ancestors, the appendix was very well developed. There's also another unusual way to demonstrate that we are a product of evolution. Atavisms. Atavisms, of course, are not present in everyone. They occasionally appear in people when certain genes, long turned off, are activated, and signs of some very distant ancestors appear. Sometimes, for instance, people are born with excessive hairiness, sometimes with tails, or with polythelia, multiple nipples. All these are traits that were present in our primate ancestors, in fact, a very long time ago, more than 30 million years ago. But to this day, these traits are still preserved in our genes, and they can even reappear if some ancient gene is accidentally activated due to some kind of embryonic failure. So this all further proves that indeed our ancestors were primates, and that we are the product of a long evolutionary process. I have mentioned religion several times today, and there is a common myth that Darwin's main goal was to destroy all religion. In general, Darwinism is seen as the main opponent of religion, the enemy of faith. But in reality, this is not the case. Firstly, even Darwin himself noted that the beginnings of evolutionary teaching were present in ancient philosophers who perfectly believed in God, and the ancient philosophers even in gods, but at the same time, they already assumed that species could change. So this combined perfectly in their minds. Moreover, if we turn to, say, the Bible, or we could turn to other religious books, we can notice that sometimes very interesting points in these sacred texts align closely with modern evolutionary theory. For example, the idea that life originally started in water is an intriguing remark and coincides with modern biological views. But that's not all. In fact, many scientists perfectly believed in God and at the same time researched evolution and proved its existence. They perceived sacred scripture not as an absolutely accurate text of how everything was, but as a certain representation, or perhaps a moral teaching. Indeed, the existence of God as a supreme entity that created the laws of nature does not prevent us from thinking about evolution. And, in general, many modern scientists, deeply religious people, and even Charles Darwin himself, who studied sacred scripture in his childhood and almost became a priest, do not find a conflict here. Practically until the end of his life, he communicated with clergy, and even one of his close friends was a high-ranking priest, which did not prevent him from being friends with Darwin. The next myth, also somewhat intersecting with faith, is the myth of mitochondrial Eve. But whether this is a myth or not, that needs to be clarified. The term mitochondrial Eve sounds quite scientific. But was there ever a woman who is the ancestor of all modern humans? Was she the sole woman on the planet? Was there an Adam for this Eve? Let's try to figure all this out. So, where did the message about some mitochondrial Eve come from? Actually, all this stemmed from a perfectly scientific article about genetics published in 1985. However, the term mitochondrial Eve was not mentioned in this article. This term appeared a bit later. The article discussed the so-called lucky mother. What is this lucky mother? What is mitochondrial Eve? To answer these questions, we need to take a closer look at our cells and remember what mitochondria are. Mitochondria are parts of each of our cells, and very important parts at that. They can be described as power stations that provide energy to our entire organism. Mitochondria are capable of intracellular digestion, meaning that they receive substances like glucose and transform this glucose into energy, which sustains the cell's existence and, in fact, the existence of the entire living organism. Mitochondria are present in all eukaryotes, that is, in all organisms with a nucleus, and of course, in all multicellular organisms, because any multicellular being is made up of cells with a nucleus. What makes mitochondria intriguing? Mitochondria are intriguing due to their extreme autonomy. Unlike other parts of cells, they are capable of dividing independently. They have a remarkably complex appearance. We come to the point that mitochondria even have their own genetic apparatus, containing a circular DNA molecule. Those who know a bit more about biology understand that circular DNA molecules are only found in bacteria. This means mitochondria resemble bacteria. It's as if there's a feeling that a bacterium lives in each cell of our body and feels quite at home there. And you know, most likely, that is exactly the case. According to the modern concept, the ancestor of all modern cells with a nucleus, all eukaryotic cells, once engulfed one of the bacteria. This bacterium remained inside that cell, and then it was simply passed from cell to cell. When a cell divides, it also divides these bacteria, and they spread to the daughter cells. In this way, over millions and billions of years of evolution, these cohabitants, which help us obtain energy, are transmitted from the parent cell to the daughter cells. It's a beneficial arrangement for them and us. We protect them from the environment and harmful organisms, provide them with numerous nutrients, and in return, they give us energy. Indeed, the mitochondrion is a unique part of the cell that contains its own genetic apparatus. It is possible to study not only the genes of the cell itself, but also the genes of the mitochondria in the cells. Of course, mitochondrial genes in cells will also vary greatly among different organisms, as organisms undergo a long evolutionary journey. In humans, mitochondria are unique, already very different from the mitochondria of other primates, and have their own genetic apparatus and specific genes. Moreover, the mitochondria of each person differ slightly from the mitochondria of all other people, because mitochondria also evolve and change slightly. But unlike nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA does not mix, so mitochondria evolve in a more straightforward manner. It's possible to track their evolution, the rate at which they evolve, which is constant, and roughly determine, for example, when the paths of two different people diverged. By comparing their mitochondria and examining the differences in their mitochondrial DNA, one can understand how distantly related they are and when their common ancestor, who had identical mitochondria, lived before mutations began accumulating. Such research is actively conducted now, not only for individual people, but for all of humanity. And when they studied the mitochondria of a wide variety of human representatives, obviously not every person on Earth, it was discovered that they all had a common ancestor. Well, this is, in principle, quite logical. All living beings on Earth once had a common ancestor. This ancestor lived approximately 200,000 years ago, and this common ancestor is what they called the lucky mother, or mitochondrial Eve. It's also interesting to pay attention to the following point. Mitochondria are parts of a cell. For a mitochondrion to be passed from the mother's cell to the child's cell, a cell had to be transmitted from the mother to the child. You probably remember that in the process of reproduction, a large, beautiful egg cell comes from the mother, while a small sperm cell comes from the father, which essentially contains only a nucleus, and there's hardly any cell body. This means that only genetic material penetrates the cell from the father, but mitochondria do not. Therefore, mitochondria, along with their mitochondrial DNA, are passed on only from the mother to the offspring. Moreover, if a mother has a son, or even, for instance, 10 sons, but not a single daughter, then her mitochondrial DNA will not be passed on any further. This is because sons do not pass on the cell, they only pass on genetic information. The cell will be transmitted from another woman. Therefore, it turns out that mitochondrial DNA is transmitted only through the female line, and specifically from girls to girls. Why is this so important? Because when we talk about mitochondrial Eve, the progenitor of all humans on Earth, you must understand that she was not the only woman on Earth from whom all people are descended. When she lived 200,000 years ago, there were many other women. Moreover, our genes contain information from these other women. The only thing in our genes, in our cells, that does not come from these other women is the mitochondria. The mitochondria were inherited only from the progenitor, from mitochondrial Eve. I'll provide a simple example to make it clear. Every person has two grandmothers. For instance, I have my maternal grandmother, Sarah, and my paternal grandmother, Jessica. I know for certain that my mitochondria are the same as grandmother Sarah's, because mitochondria from my paternal grandmother, Jessica, could not have been passed on to me, as my father did not pass on his mitochondria to me. However, this does not mean that I don't have genes from my second grandmother. About a quarter of her genes are in me, but in the nuclear DNA. The mitochondria were inherited only from my mother's mother. Therefore, when we talk about mitochondrial Eve, we must understand that she passed on only her mitochondria to us. As for what's in the nuclear DNA, that's something else that needs to be figured out. And it's very likely that we no longer have any genes in our nuclear DNA from this progenitor, but we did inherit her mitochondrial DNA. This is because it so happened that an unbroken female line descended from this lucky mother over 200,000 years. That is, her daughters always had daughters, allowing this mitochondrial DNA to be preserved. All right, well, can we speak of a mitochondrial or any other type of atom? Definitely not a mitochondrial one, as I have already explained why. However, we can talk about a Y chromosomal atom. Sure. The reason is that while mitochondria can be transmitted only through the maternal line, the Y chromosome, on the contrary, can be transmitted only through the male line. Therefore, it can also be traced. I remind you that women have two sex chromosomes, X and X, while men have two sex chromosomes, X and Y. Therefore, if a girl is born, she does not receive a Y chromosome, otherwise, she wouldn't be a girl. In boys, the Y chromosome is retained, but the Y chromosome can only come to a boy from his father. There are no other possibilities. Hence, theoretically, it's possible to trace back to some distant ancestor using the Y chromosome. For instance, if we now find a very ancient human, study his DNA, suppose it's superbly preserved, and suddenly we see that his Y chromosome is the same as ours, then we can say that he is definitely our distant forefather. Furthermore, we can compare all the Y chromosomes of people on Earth and try to determine when our common ancestor, this ancient father, with an unbroken line of male descendants, lived. This is exactly what was done, and researchers calculated the time when the so-called Y chromosomal Adam lived. That's what he was named. It turns out he lived a long time ago, but exactly how long ago is not very clear, as there are different estimates. Initially, it was thought that he lived about 50,000 years ago, then 100,000 years ago, 150,000 years ago, 300,000, and even 350,000 years ago. In general, unfortunately, calculating the Y chromosomal atom turned out to be more challenging than determining mitochondrial Eve. In any case, it's important to understand that mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal atom never met. They lived at absolutely different times, and they are not the sole ancestors of all currently living people. They are among the ancestors. In other words, roughly speaking, if we were to travel back in time and prevent mitochondrial Eve from giving birth to a child, perhaps by taking her away in a time machine or eliminating her in some way, it would mean that no modern human would exist on Earth in the form we are now. But this would not mean that humanity would disappear. Instead, every person on Earth would be different, because the course of development would have changed. We would have had different ancestors, and we would not be ourselves but some other people. However, there still would be humans, because there were many women, and there would simply be some other lucky mother who would leave her descendants. So, we are all descendants of mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam, but they are not our only ancestors. All right, let's move on to the next myth. The next myth states that Darwin renounced his theory. Where did this idea originate? The roots of this myth are well known and precisely identified. The myth emerged in 1915, and it was not a myth but a newspaper report by someone known as Lady Hope. This preacher, who supposedly visited Darwin when he was bedridden and seriously ill, detailed in this newspaper how Darwin, in the last hours of his life, confessed to her that he was disillusioned with evolutionary theory, deeply believed in God, and renounced evolutionary ideas. However, essentially, as soon as this myth appeared, it was immediately dispelled. Despite this, it continues to circulate and reappears quite often through mass media. The myth was dispelled by Darwin's children, who first of all informed that Lady Hope had actually never met Charles Darwin. Therefore, it's highly unlikely she could recount anything about his last words if, in principle, they never crossed paths during his lifetime. Another point is that Darwin died quite quickly, and there was no prolonged period where he lay bedridden, rethinking his life, and so on. Such events did not occur in the life of Charles Darwin. Additionally, Darwin's biographer also wrote that, according to his information, there was no meeting between Lady Hope and Darwin, and most likely, the entire story was entirely fabricated. And the last myth I'd like to address today is the notion that Darwinism has long been debunked. According to this myth, Darwin's theories have been revoked. The theory of evolution in its original form no longer exists, and it's unclear why it is still taught in schools, needlessly confusing young minds. You know, the most paradoxical thing is that among the many myths we've discussed today, this myth is largely true. Indeed, Darwin put forward his theory around the 1850s and 1860s. It's understood that no scientific theory, even an exceptional one, remains unchanged for over 150 years. Therefore, to some extent, Darwinism in its original form has indeed been revised. But it's not that Darwin's theory is incorrect. Rather, it has evolved and acquired a new name and new content. The first radical change in the theory of evolution occurred with the emergence of the synthetic theory, namely when genetics was integrated with Darwinism. When Darwin wrote his writings, he knew nothing about genetics. The saddest thing is that he could have learned about genes, and, in principle, Gregor Mendel, who is the originator of genetics, sent his writings to Darwin, but it is not even known whether Darwin read Mendel, but even if he did, he could not appreciate the scale of thought. This was indeed unfortunate. But later, when genetics emerged, it initially seemed to completely refute evolutionary theory, as things at the genetic level turned out to be far from simple. However, the more researchers delved into genetics, the more they realized that genetics does not contradict evolutionary theory, but rather refines and modifies it. Moreover, genetics helped fill some of the gaps in Darwinism and address paradoxes that Darwin himself couldn't resolve. The paradox referred to here is known as Jenkins' paradox, or sometimes as Jenkins' catastrophe, or swamping effect. The essence of this argument, proposed by an engineer named Jenkins, came a few years after Darwin's The Origin of Species was published. Jenkins argued that natural selection could not operate as Darwin suggested. He presented a hypothetical scenario where a white man, considered progressive in the 19th century context, arrives on an island inhabited only by indigenous people of African descent. Jenkins suggested that this white man, being intelligent and assertive, would quickly become a local king, establish a large harem, and leave many offspring. These offspring, inheriting the progressive white blood, would be super intelligent, maintain their throne, and become leaders. Jenkins' argument was based on the 19th century racial views and aimed to challenge Darwin's theory of natural selection, suggesting that the traits of a single individual could not significantly impact the gene pool of a large population. This argument reflected a misunderstanding of the evolutionary process and the role of natural selection in shaping genetic diversity. The introduction of genetics into evolutionary theory later addressed and resolved many of these misunderstandings and paradoxes. But there are many residents on the island, and gradually, over dozens of generations, not a single drop of this white blood remains. It disappears completely. Although it would seem that the trait was so progressive, but this natural selection does not work, and the trait disappears completely. Darwin could not explain such a paradox by Jenkins. But thanks to this remarkable paradox, Darwin received the title of a racist. But note, it was not Darwin who described this whole remarkable concept, but Jenkins. Well, and of course, we now also understand that in no way does the Negroid race yield to the Caucasian race, either in terms of intellectual abilities or in terms of any physical indicators. Therefore, this example would not have worked anyway. The idea itself is quite curious. Indeed, if some progressive trait is manifested, it should just be diluted and disappear because all the others around are non-progressive. And this is one single creature, one single, mutation that occurred. There was no term for mutations then, but as we would now call it. So genetics was able to explain how to actually resolve this paradox. The point is that the information recorded in our cells is discrete. That is, it is not some kind of boundless broth in which, if you drop a droplet of some valuable liquid, it just disperses and disappears. It's like a set of beads. If you put one bead in there, it won't just disappear. If it truly is a progressive trait, it will prevail. Recall, for instance, the example of Y chromosomal Adam we just discussed. That means, even if it's been only 50,000 years, let's take the smallest figures for Y chromosomal Adam, the Y chromosome from that progressive man who lived 50,000 years ago has reached each one of us. Perhaps he had some kind of a breakthrough trait. It's not proven that the reason was precisely in this breakthrough trait. It might have been sheer luck, but suppose he had a breakthrough trait that allowed him to survive. And this trait was inscribed in the Y chromosome, and this Y chromosome has reached us. It didn't disappear. Genetics was able to explain many interesting and unusual aspects of Darwin's theory in this way. As a result, the theory of evolution changed but was not abolished. If we compare the fundamental views on evolution from the perspective of classical Darwinism and the modern synthetic theory of evolution, we'll see that many nuances have emerged. But the essence, in fact, remained the same. For instance, while it was previously believed that the primary small unit of evolution was the species, it is now thought to be the population. It's not the species that changes, but only specific parts of the species that find themselves in certain limited conditions, such as on an island or in a small forest. Furthermore, If it was previously believed that the material of evolution was simply variability, with an unclear origin, we now know that it's primarily mutational variability, as well as the combination of different genes. And the factors of evolution have also changed. Previously, the focus was on the struggle for existence, natural selection, heredity, and variability. Now, genetic drift and population waves are considered among the main factors of evolution. Genetic drift refers to the random change in genes, while population waves are periodic changes in a particular gene in a population, where suddenly a large number of a certain gene appears and may become established in the population. But we won't delve into the details right now. The one aspect that has remained absolutely unchanged is natural selection. As it was previously considered the main factor of evolution, it is still believed to be so. Regardless of the factors leading to changes, these changes can only become established through natural selection, because only the most adapted organisms are selected. The most significant development is that even the evolutionary theory has not stopped evolving. As time progresses, even the synthetic theory of evolution is becoming outdated. A new theory of evolution has emerged, which could be termed as the third evolutionary stage, Darwinism III. This new phase is called evolutionary developmental biology, or more commonly abbreviated as Evo-Devo. Evo-Devo combines the synthetic theory of evolution with developmental biology. Currently, developmental biology is a progressive field that examines how embryos develop, how they change, which genes activate at which moments, what triggers their activation, and how environmental factors can influence genes. This combination with evolutionary theory has significantly enriched our understanding of how organisms change over time. In the field of evolutionary developmental biology, there are several key concepts, not all of which are the most crucial, but some are quite fascinating. I won't list all the points right now, but I will focus on a couple of particularly interesting ones. For example, according to evolutionary developmental biology, changes in phenotype, which are the external characteristics, can precede or occur before changes in genotype. Sometimes the genes may remain the same while a new trait emerges. This is how the new field of biology, known as epigenetics, works. It's quite surprising. Even for those familiar with biology, it seems almost bizarre. How can a new trait appear if the genes don't change? And how can such a trait become established and passed on to offspring? This concept seems to echo Lamarckism. You might recall Lamarck's theory, which suggested that a giraffe could extend its neck through stretching, and this beneficial trait would then be passed on to its descendants. Lamarck believed that this was how evolution operated. Later, it seemed that Darwin came along and stated that no, evolution doesn't work like that, and traits that manifest in an organism cannot be passed on to offspring. And then epigenetics emerges, suggesting once again that sometimes traits can be passed on to offspring. This raises questions. What is this phenomenon? How does it all work? Indeed, it's complex but fascinating. We won't delve into the in-depth details now, but I can tell you that some genes may express or not express themselves externally, meaning they start to function, and this trait can be passed on to offspring due to changes in certain connections within, for example, DNA. This means there's a slight change, not in the nucleotides, but perhaps in the phosphate bases attached to these nucleotides, not in the sequence of nitrogenous bases, but maybe in some residues of phosphoric acid, or for instance, covalent bonds might change. So the chemistry changes slightly while the sequence of beads in the DNA remains the same. But, for example, these beads might not go straight anymore, but somehow stick together or turn slightly, forming some new, unusual connections. As a result, a gene that didn't work before starts working, or starts working slightly differently. This can occur as a result of various external influences, and such new functioning of genes can be passed on to offspring. That is, the genes remain the same as in the parents, but they will express themselves as they did in this particular organism as a result of some random environmental impact. It's all quite complex, but indeed very interesting. There are also concepts like kin selection, which weren't much thought about before, but are now being studied in detail. Prominent examples of kin selection are found in bees and ants. In kin selection, part of the population may sacrifice itself so that the most valuable individuals can pass on their genetic material. From the perspective of classical Darwinian theory, this seems nonsensical, but we know that evolution indeed operates this way. Another interesting aspect is that adaptations can occur not just through genetic changes, but also through culture and learning. It's known that a great deal is transmitted through learning, and organisms indeed become more developed in this way. By teaching their offspring, they adapt to the environment without changing their genes. In summary, there are many nuances, all of which are fascinating, but none of them negate Darwinism. They only refine it, adding an additional layer to the classical basis of Darwin's theory of evolution. So it turns out that the theory of evolution is even more complex than we previously thought, but it works. So the conclusions from today's lecture are as follows. The theory of evolution is just one of many scientific theories. It is not the ultimate truth or a belief. Sometimes people ask me if I believe in Darwin. I don't believe in Darwin, nor in the evolutionary theory as a matter of faith. I simply consider it the best and most functional concept currently available. Indeed, all new data we receive only refine the theory of evolution, but do not negate it. Therefore, it seems to be a working theory. My lecture is coming to an end, but now I will try to answer some of your questions that may have arisen during my narrative. At least, I will try to familiarize myself with these questions, if there are any, of course. Now let's find out. All right, here's a question from a viewer. What about accommodation and the soft skull of an infant? I understand this as an addition to the idea that the birth canal is so narrow that childbirth is very difficult for women nowadays. However, even the soft skull of an infant, unfortunately, does not solve all problems. If the soft skull of an infant were an ideal adaptation that allowed women to give birth without any problems, I'm sure millions of women around the world would be extremely happy. But unfortunately, this is not the case. Yes, you are absolutely right. It's an evolutionary adaptation that has developed over millions of years. Indeed, to some extent, this unique and remarkable feature, having a soft skull in infancy, makes us more advanced than we would be without it. But unfortunately, as I said, it doesn't solve all problems. Therefore, yes, it's an adjustment, one of the accommodations. But in no way does that, I don't think, refute the fact that we're not perfect and we're imperfect. Okay, that's a good question. How could such an imperfect creature as a human manage to reproduce so extensively? Indeed, the answer to this question becomes apparent upon reflection. Despite our numerous imperfections, which include not just the less than ideal functioning of our organs with less than 100% efficiency or perfect balance, we also aren't the fastest, most agile, most clawed, or toothed creatures. However, we are well aware that we are intelligent beings, remarkably intelligent, in fact, with limbs capable of fine manipulation, creating tools, and altering our environment. These factors, our intelligence and the ability to manipulate our environment, have been our main evolutionary advantages. They have enabled us to reproduce extensively and become one of the most successful mammals on our planet. I am sure it is no secret to you, but in case you thought that by talking about our imperfect body, I want to say that a human is such a negligible being that it's unclear how they exist on our planet. Well, no, of course not at all. We have a very well-developed body, but I just want to note that it was not designed in such a form. It appeared as a result of long-term evolution and continues to evolve. And it's possible that even some parts of our body will become even better over time. Well, let's say they would have if we continued to evolve according to Darwin's theory. Whether it's good or bad, we are no longer evolving according to the classic concept, because now almost all of our descendants survive thanks to medicine. Therefore, we no longer undergo natural selection, so we have stopped changing. But before that, we really changed for a long time and constantly improved slightly. And as a result, we have reached the heights we see now. Although there are some things I would like to correct, unfortunately, that's how it turned out. It turned out as it did. How will humans change in response to the rapid development of technologies? First and foremost, with the rapid development of technology, we can observe that people have become much better at surviving and generally live longer. Though some try to argue that in the Stone Age, people lived correctly, in harmony with nature, ate well, and were all healthy, this is a somewhat romanticized view. Let's recall the fact that our ancestors were few in number and lived relatively short lives. Generally, the average lifespan of humanity for most of its history has been about 25 to 30 years, perhaps even less, around 22 to 28 years. So, you'd agree that this isn't particularly inspiring. Nowadays, in reality, we live much better, all thanks to technology. However, on the other hand, there are some drawbacks, as genes that would have been eliminated by natural selection are preserved. Undoubtedly, for those with certain genetic diseases, this is very beneficial. These individuals would not have survived without modern medicine. However, whether this is ultimately beneficial for humanity as a whole remains to be seen in the future. In any case, again, as we already see in our time, the evolution of our technologies leads to the constant improvement of what natural evolution hasn't perfected, and generally speaking, by a certain age, people are already turning into these cyborgs who have replaced all the body parts that start to fail. I think that in the future, the evolution of technology will lead to an even greater number of artificial organs or artificially grown organs. Well, and this will probably lead to people living even longer. Maybe we will finally live to be at least 150 years old. That would be very nice. Do viruses and particle radiation, such as alpha, beta, and gamma radiation, influence evolutionary processes in organisms? If they do, could you describe the mechanisms of this impact? I can immediately say that yes, they undoubtedly have an impact, but I would not like to delve into the mechanisms right now, because it's a lengthy topic and really a subject for a separate lecture. In general, from the simple influences that can be quickly explained, we know how radiations, for instance, affect organisms. Any sufficiently active radiation leads to mutations. Many have heard about the mutants of Chernobyl, and there are many humorous comments, memes, and interesting images on this topic, but there are also many sad facts about the numerous radiation sicknesses, including among the people who dealt with the aftermath of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident. These various diseases arose because mutations occurred. Individual genes stopped functioning properly, or new, altered, and disrupted genes appeared. And all this, more often than not, led to relatively quick death. In principle, sometimes mutations can be beneficial because they provide material for natural selection. They add more variability of various kinds. But unfortunately, most mutations are harmful, although sometimes it happens that some mutations can be beneficial. I apologize, I misspoke slightly. Most mutations are neutral, many are harmful, and very few are beneficial. Beneficial mutations lead to evolution. Therefore, the more mutations there are, the greater the chances that something evolutionarily new will emerge. Sometimes people even deliberately irradiate certain things to produce as many mutants as possible, among which something particularly interesting might be found. Of course, such experiments are not conducted on humans or even animals like dogs, cats, or rats, but rather on microorganisms. When trying to obtain interesting strains of microorganisms, they are irradiated to induce more mutations. Most of them die, or the mutations do not manifest any characteristics, but some acquire valuable traits that can then be utilized. Another example related to the impact of viruses is that sometimes when viruses infiltrate an organism, they leave a part of their genetic material inside that organism. Viruses possess a unique mechanism that allows them to integrate into DNA, including our own. Often the organism manages to overcome the virus, leaving no trace of the viral DNA. But sometimes the virus integrates so cunningly that the organism doesn't notice it and then replicates this part of the genome with viral changes. As a result, these altered DNA can sometimes be passed on to offspring, and eventually we find fragments of viruses in their DNA. Most such viral integrations into DNA are neutral. We now know that our own DNA contains many fragments from ancient viruses that once infected our distant ancestors, including those from RNA viruses. I can't provide an exact number, but I believe it's in the tens or hundreds. We know that viruses have infected us many times, and often fragments of these viruses have remained permanently in our DNA. Most of these viral traits have not manifested in us, but there are sometimes amusing inclusions that lead to beneficial mutations. For instance, based on current data, we believe that one virus gave our distant ancestors the ability to carry offspring for an extended period, leading to the emergence of modern placental mammals. Previously, offspring were carried for a very short time, after which they were perceived as foreign bodies by the organism and were expelled. The young were born very small and non-viable, and to survive, they had to stay in a pouch in ancient mammals, continuing their development there. In other words, ancient mammals living around 100 million years ago and earlier were marsupials, and there were no placental mammals. But that at some point, our distant ancestors were infected by a virus, and this virus, integrating into the DNA, disrupted the chain of events leading to the rejection of the fetus. In other words, the fetus stopped being perceived as a foreign entity. As a result, the fetus could stay in the body much longer, allowing for a longer gestation period and the birth of a larger offspring. This led to the emergence of placental mammals in our modern understanding. Thus, sometimes viruses help us evolve. And finally, now we'll check. I believe this is the last question. Is the emergence of more complex multicellular organisms 600 million years ago related to the end of the so-called snowball Earth glacial period? Yes, to put it very briefly, yes. Indeed, there have been global glacial periods. While no one was present to witness these events firsthand, there are numerous geological evidences suggesting that at certain points in the history of our planet, the glaciations were so intense that nearly the entire planet was covered in ice. There are two known instances in Earth's history referred to as snowball Earth periods. The first instance occurred around 2 billion years ago, a little more, somewhere between 2 billion and 2 billion years ago. The second instance was around 650 to 600 million years ago, no, even earlier, between 700 and 650 million years ago. This period is called the Cryogenian, meaning the freezing period. It's somewhat suspicious, but distinctly after the end of the Cryogenian period, complex multicellular life appears, which then continued to evolve. And actually, part of this multicellular life gave rise to modern multicellular organisms. On one hand, it seems suspicious and could appear as a coincidence, but on the other hand, it most likely isn't a coincidence. Indeed, this snowball Earth, this global glaciation, likely led to the emergence of new multicellular organisms. One possible explanation for how glaciation could have stimulated evolution is related to the fact that oxygen dissolves better in cold water. Such global cooling could have led to a significant increase in the oxygen levels in the water. Oxygen is likely one of the key factors that can limit evolution. In other words, if the oxygen level is below a certain threshold, evolution cannot progress further. Scientists now believe that until there was enough oxygen, approximately 1% of the current atmospheric oxygen content, life could not become eukaryotic. No cell with a nucleus appeared until the oxygen level reached 1% of the current level, and only then did the first eukaryotic cells emerge. The same goes for multicellularity. Until there was enough oxygen, it wasn't advantageous to become multicellular. There simply wasn't enough energy to sustain multicellularity. But as soon as there was enough oxygen, life became multicellular. The next threshold stage, when the oxygen content slightly increased again, crossing a certain threshold value, allowed life to develop a hard skeleton and a hard shell. This again dramatically stimulated evolution, leading to the so-called Cambrian explosion. But what is the Cambrian explosion? What interesting thing happened there? I am sure that if you are curious, you can learn and hear about it in our course on evolution. Thank you very much for your attention. I sincerely hope that I have managed to show you that evolution exists, that there are now sufficient proofs of the existence of evolution, and that, at the very least, the evolutionary theory is currently the most substantiated and functional theory in biology. And in general, it is indeed one of the most justified theories among all scientific theories currently known. And with that, I bid you farewell. Goodbye.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and don't miss out on new videos and lectures.